come down. Nope, come down, go down the stairs. Friends, will you pray with me? And as you feel so familiar and comfortable, I invite you to join in the second time through. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Amen. All right, friends, it is the Sunday, the first Sunday in November, where we celebrate the saints. We celebrate All Saints' Day, which was officially November 1st, and All Souls' Day, November 2nd, and we remember the saints who have come before us. And I am just so excited about this beautiful altar scene that we have created together this morning, remembering our saints. And I'm sure there are faces familiar to many of us and unfamiliar, and there are books, and there's a teapot, and a sweatshirt, and a Bible, and photos, and a rock. And this is one of my favorite Sundays of every church year, because the sanctuary to me feels so full. Like the saints are really with us today. And so I wanted to talk a little bit today about the generations of the saints that are actually currently living. So we'll begin, and I would invite, if there is somebody from each of the generations, one person who would be willing and able to come up and sit before us to do that. If not, that's fine, we'll just have our sign. So the first generation is the silent generation, and that is people who were born between 1925 and 1945. Do we have anyone from the silent generation? And if you don't want to come up, you can just raise your hand. You have a seat. Okay. You want to come up or you want to stay? You can come up. Sure, why not? All right. I know this is asking people to out their age a little bit, which I know culturally is a little bit, risky, but all right, so I will have you sit right in this place of honor. Sure.
I'm going to be silent, but I do bring Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, because that was the book that inspired me to get involved with the environment. And I helped in Massachusetts to start a recycling program in Concord, Mass. And then later I worked with wonderful people who finally, after 10 years, got a bottle bill passed in Massachusetts. And if you don't know what that is, New Hampshire, you're excused, because New Hampshire is the only state in New England that does not have a bottle bill. And what it is you pay 5 cents a bottle, and you bring it back, and you get that back. And it was a way of getting people to bring bottles back, and it worked successfully in Massachusetts. I just want to say I wasn't completely silent. By the 60s and by the 70s, I was pretty involved, and I think it's important to let people know that.
Thank you. All right, you can have a seat here. Yes, I actually was unaware that this was called the silent generation. That was news to me. I think I would too. I absolutely would too. So the children of the silent generation are children of the Great Depression. So their parents, having sort of reveled in the highs of the roaring 20s, now faced great economic hardship and struggled to provide for their families. Now, of course, these are very broad, sweeping cultural narratives, so keep that in mind. Before reaching their teens, they shared with their parents the horrors of World War II, but through children's eyes. Many lost their fathers or older siblings who were killed in the war. They saw the fall of Nazism and the catastrophic devastation made capable of the nuclear bomb. When the silent generation began coming of age after World War II, They were faced with a devastating social order within which they would spend their early adulthood and a new enemy in communism via the betrayal of post-war agreements and the rise of the Soviet Union. Nodding. This is very familiar to you guys. So unlike the previous generation who had fought for changing the system, the silent generation was about working within the system. They did this by keeping their heads down and working hard, thus earning themselves the silent label. Clearly not all of them, though. So their attitudes leaned toward not being risk takers and playing it safe. The Fortune magazine story on the college class of '49 was subtitled "Taking No Chances." And so this generation was also heavily influenced by the radio, the golden age of radio, the rise of trade unions, transatlantic flight, and the discovery of penicillin during their formative years. Now, they may have, they were known as a very frugal generation. The examples set forth by their parents tend to be thrifty, and get their money's worth, and not, as you may know, some people who sort of tend to the hoarding side of it, and really not wanting to let anything go that might be useful, and doesn't want to be wasteful. Now, despite the theory that this is the silent conforming generation, some famous silent generation folks included Muhammad Ali, Bob Dylan, Noam Chomsky, Martin Luther King Jr., and Jimi Hendrix. So, the beginners and the leaders of the revolution in the 60s were actually members of the silent generation, maybe not so silent. All right, so the next generation, 1946 to 1964, the boomers, the baby boomers. And do I have a volunteer to be the representative of the baby boomers? Coming forward. All right, Mo, come on up. I appreciate you being able to claim the baby boomer label. All right. So the boomers, so named because of the large number of children that were born in that generation. Is that right? No? Yeah, okay. Okay. So they came up with were brought up with significant reforms in education. Because of the ideological confrontation of the Cold War. And so in the 60s and 70s, so the oldest would have turned 18 in 1964. They and around them created a very specific rhetoric around their cohort and the social movements brought about by the size and numbers, such as the counterculture of the 60s and its backlash. So many boomers came of age in a time of increasing affluence and widespread government subsidies in post-war housing and education, and grew up genuinely expecting the world to improve with time. Those with higher standards of living and educational levels were often the most demanding of betterment. In the US, the generation can be segmented into two broadly defined cohorts: the leading edge baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1955, and who came of age during the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights eras, which is about slightly more than half of the generation, and then the other half, all right, so that's Mo, she's the leading edge boomer. The second other half, sometimes called Generation Jones, or the trailing edge boomers, was born between 1956 and 64, and came of age after Vietnam and the Watergate scandal. So many items, which were previously deemed luxurious, such as a private washing machine, the refrigerator, and the telephone, entered mass production for the average consumer. So this was, these were fancy luxuries that now are household items. The average person could live like the upper class in previous generations. Technological advances made before, during, and after the war, such as plastics, television, magnetic tape, transistors, integrated circuits, and lasers, played a key role in the tremendous improvements in the standards of living for the average citizen in the developed world. So prosperity was taken for granted. This is a period of optimism. So full employment and inflation were the norm. In the United States, the boomers lived through a period of dramatic cultural cleavage between the left-leaning proponents of change and the more conservative individuals. And there are some who believe that this is sort of what started to lead into even the divide that we have today, started in that generation. This is the generation that is known for hippies, rock and roll, and feminism. There were dramatic shifts in marriage and divorce rates. Marriage rates went way down, and this is the generation that sort of made divorce an okay thing culturally. And a shifting in religion, so both more towards the conservative and evangelical movement that sort of started in that generation, and also more liberal and not religious. So this is sort of that shift. All right, Gen X, which is 1965 to 1980. Eric, you're not with this one. All right, so I'll sit here. So I figured I was probably the only one here. Maybe. There might be some. Oh, yeah. Okay. There are some. Ooh, I'm not the only Gen Xer. All right, come on up. Anybody else want to be the representative? All right, I know. It's such a Gen X thing. You guys totally forgot.
I'd be the leading edge.
You were the leading edge of the Gen X, and I'm the trailing edge. There we go. All right. So Generation X, 1965 to 1980. As children in the 70s and 80s, it was a time of shifting societal values. Gen Xers were sometimes called the latchkey generation, or often forgotten. The forgotten generation that skipped over. People are like, boomers, millennials, and we're like, oh my. Anyway, so that stems from the returning of children to an empty home and needing to use the door key because there were two working parents in most households. There's also an increase in divorce rates and as I said, increased participation of maternal figures in the workforce. So as adolescents and young adults in the 80s and 90s, Xers were dubbed the MTV generation, reference to the music video channel, sometimes being characterized as slackers, cynical, and disaffected. Yeah. Some of the many cultural influences on Gen X youth included a proliferation of musical genres with strong social tribal identities such as punk, post-punk, and heavy metal, in addition to later forms developed by the Gen Xers themselves like grunge, grindcore, and related genres. Film, both the birth of franchise mega sequels and the proliferation of independent films was notable, and video games, both in amusement parlors and in devices inside individual homes, were a major part of juvenile entertainment for the first time. Gen Xers were children at a time when society was less focused on children and more focused on adults. So Xers were children during a time of increasing divorce rates. Divorce rates doubling in the mid-1960s before peaking in the 80s. So we were the children of the big divorce happening. And it also, it happened that there's this whole shift in the idea of single-parent households because in most states, shared custody was not a thing. It was a single parent, mostly the mother, usually was the one who was taking custody, and so it was always single parents. Only 9 states in the 1970s allowed for shared custody after divorce, and that then shifted in the mid-80s when all the rest of the country jumped in. So we came of age, the Gen Xers, or were children during the 1980s crack epidemic. We had fear of the impending AIDS epidemic with the 80s and 90s loomed over our formative years and as we headed into adolescence. And we were the first children to have access to personal computers in our homes and in schools. Not anything like they are today, but we had them. And we grew up post-Jim, we're the first generation to grow up post-Jim Crow. So we had the first starting of integrating schools, and we were considered the least racist generation. We were post-Title IX, so we were girls' athletics were just accepted thing, and we were more highly educated than our parents were. The political front, the Gen Xers became ambivalent, if not outright disaffected by politics. We are known for not voting. But we had been reared in the shadow of the Vietnam War and Watergate, and we came to maturity under Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and we had first-hand experience of the impact of neoliberal policies. And few of us had experienced a Democratic administration, and even then sort of just in an atmosphere level if we were kids. For those on the left of the political spectrum, the disappointment with the previous boomer student mobilizations of the 60s and the collapse of those movements toward a consumerist, greed is good and yuppie culture during the 1980s felt like hypocrisy, if not outright betrayal. So we were preoccupied then with authenticity and not selling out. And so now we are well into our middle age, and we are known as independent, resilient, resourceful, self-managing, adaptable, cynical, pragmatic, skeptical of authority, and seeking a work-life balance. So that is Generation X. All right, millennials. Eric, you want to come on? You're Gen X too. We don't have any millennials. Maybe we don't have any millennials. That is not surprising. Oh, yeah, there we go. James. All right, James is a millennial. Do you want to come on? All right. Is that in here? Here, I'll have you come up this way, James. Come on up, and you can sit in the seat next to Amy. There you go. All right, cool. Millennials. I don't know, they may have even a worse reputation than Gen X at this point. All right, they are the first generation to grow up with the internet fully. They have been described as the first global generation. They are generally marked by elevated usage of and familiarity with the internet, mobile devices, and social media. They are termed digital natives, which are now applied to any generation after them, was originally coined to describe them. They have also been called the unluckiest generation because the average millennial has experienced slower economic growth since entering the workforce than any other generation in U.S. history. They have also been weighed down by student loan debt and childcare costs. So across the globe, young people have postponed marriage or living together as a couple. Millennials were born at a time of declining fertility rates around the world and are having fewer children than their predecessors. Since the 2000 census, millennials have been taking advantage of the possibility of selecting more than one racial group in abundance. Pursuing a sense of belonging becomes a means of achieving a sense of being needed. Millennials experience belonging by seeking to impact the world. They have benefited the least from economic recovery following the Great Recession, as average incomes for this generation have fallen at twice the general adult population's total drop, and are likely to be on the path toward lower incomes for at least another decade. Sorry, millennials. Despite higher college attendance rates than Generation X, many are stuck in low-paying jobs, with the percentage of degree-educated adults working in low-wage industries rising from 23% to 33% between 2000 and 2014. So that's a decade ago, but still pretty true, I think. Millennials are the least likely to be religious when compared to older generations, and millennials in adulthood are detached from institutions and networked with friends. So those are the millennials. All right, Gen Z, that is mid-1990s to early 2010s. Ren, when were you born? 2009, solidly Gen Z. You want to come up? Oh, I know, you're like, oh no. You don't have to, but come on up. All right. So, compared to previous generations, Gen Z, which is early, so this is still a developing generation, right? So it may have another name at some point, and they're still sort of wishy-washy a little bit in their definition of years. So it's mid-1990s to mid-2010s-ish. Compared to previous generations, members of Generation Z tend to live more slowly than their predecessors when they were their age, have lower rates of teenage pregnancies, and consume alcohol, but not necessarily other psychoactive drugs less often. Generation Z teenagers are more concerned than older generations with academic performance and job prospects, and are better at delaying gratification than their counterparts from the 1960s, despite concerns to the contrary. The prevalence of allergies among adolescents and young adults in Gen Z is greater than the general population. There is greater awareness and diagnosis of mental health conditions, and sleep deprivation is more frequently reported. In many countries, Gen Z youth are more likely to be diagnosed with intellectual disabilities and psychiatric disorders than older generations. So around the world, members of Generation Z are spending more time on electronic devices and less time reading books than before. Nostalgia culture is a big thing. We have cottagecore, which is sort of like prairie fashion and idealism, and a love for old and vintage cars. How that's described, well, you can probably with some flexibility. There's also this love of a little like slower technology, like the digital point-and-shoot digital cameras are all the rage right now. About 20.8%, or about 1 in 5 members of Gen Z identify as LGBTQ+. And as consumers, members of Generation Z are typically reliant on the internet to research their options and place orders. They tend to be skeptical and will shun firms whose actions and values are contradictory. Their purchases are heavily influenced by trends promoted by influencers on social media, as well as the fear of missing out, otherwise known as FOMO, and peer pressure. The need to be trendy is a prime motivator. Parents of Gen Z, kids and adolescents, are spending more time with their children. In 1965, a mother spent on average 54 minutes, so nearly an hour, on child care activities each day. Whereas one from 2012 spent twice as much, 104 minutes, almost 2 hours. Among fathers, the amount of time spent on child care roughly quadrupled, from 16 minutes in 1965 to 59 in 2012. So still about half of what the women do, but the moms do, but still big like leaps there. Generation Z is the least religious generation in history. Many more members of Generation Z describe themselves as non-believers than any previous generation and reject religious affiliation altogether, though many still describe themselves as spiritual. In the United States, Generation Z has twice as many self-identified atheists as previous generations. All right, so that's Gen Z. So, Gen Alpha. Robbie, you want to come sit in the chair? Because you're in this generation. You want to? You can. You don't have to. Okay, it's fine. All right. All right, Generation Alpha. By the way, I'm actually impressed that we have all these chairs filled. Yeah. All right, so Generation Alpha is the first to be born entirely in the 21st century and the third millennium. Members of Generation Alpha are mostly children of millennials and older Generation Z. There are some Generation Z that are becoming parents just a little bit. Yep. All right. Generation Alpha has been born at a time of falling fertility rates across much of the world and are experiencing the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic as young children. For those with access, children's entertainment has been increasingly dominated by electronic technology, social networks, and streaming services, with interest in traditional television falling. Changes in the use of technology in classrooms and other aspects of life have had a significant effect on how this generation experienced early learning compared to previous generations. Studies have suggested that allergies, obesity, and health problems related to screen time have become increasingly prevalent among children in recent years. And both Gen Z and Gen Alpha have an increase in nearsightedness. This is a big thing that's happening. Generation Alpha will be significantly more affected by climate change than older generations. It's estimated that children born in 2020, which is 3 years after Robbie was born, will experience up to 7 times as many extreme weather events over their lifetimes, particularly heat waves compared to people born in 1960 under current climate policy pledges. So many members of Generation Alpha have grown up using smartphones and tablets as part of their childhood entertainment, and many being exposed to devices as a soothing distraction or educational aid. Screen time among infants, toddlers, and preschoolers exploded in the 2010s. Some 90% of young children used a handheld electronic device by the age of 1. In some cases, children started using them when they were only a few months old. Age of 1, yes. Before they were 90% of this generation has used an electronic device before they were 1 year old. 1 year old. So using smartphones and tablets to access streaming services like YouTube Kids and free or reasonably low budget mobile games became a popular form of entertainment for young children. Generation Alpha has also been surrounded by adult internet users from the beginning of their lives. Their parents are also often on screens. Their parents, who are primarily millennials, are heavy social media users, and then UNICEF in late 2021 described the COVID-19 pandemic as the biggest threat to children in our 75-year history. So amongst other effects, levels of child poverty and malnutrition have sharply increased. Education and services designed to protect vulnerable children have been disrupted across the world. Child labor rates increased, reversing a 20-year fall. And so the first wave of Generation Alpha will reach adulthood by the 2030s. And by that time, the world population is expected to be just under 9 billion. And the world will have the highest ever proportion of people over age 60. So that means this cohort right here will bear the burden of an aging population. Gen Alpha will most likely delay standard life markers such as marriage, childbirth, and retirement, as the previous generations did. And it's estimated that they will make up 11% of the global workforce by 2030. Also predicted that they will live longer and have smaller families and will be the most formally educated generation ever, the most technology supplied generation, and the globally wealthiest generation ever. So now we see this lineup of saints from all the generations that are active in the church at the moment. But if you notice, there are 2 empty chairs on either side. Can we take a guess as to what those chairs might be for? Might represent? Anybody? Yes, so these are the saints that are no longer with us, have gone before. Those are the saints that have yet to be born. At some point in our lives, we all were there, and we will all eventually be here. And in between is an opportunity to be a living witness. Now, we may not all make it all the way up through all the chairs and generations. Some of these saints that we're remembering today were in those younger generations, and some in the middle. But in our time here, we have an opportunity. This quote I found from Dorothy Day sounds, at first glance, a little bit not Christian and selfish. Like the saints, they just care about themselves. Not quite that way. In other words, they didn't worry about what other people were thinking, or what they were doing, or what the researchers and analysts said about their generation and what was expected of them, but instead focused on their calling, focused on living out the gospel, focused on doing what they could with the time they were given. And as Dorothy Day said, if other people were attracted to that, wanted to know more, wanted to join them, so much the better. But that wasn't their point. Their point was just to live as they felt so moved and so called, and to be as much a witness to the life of Jesus Christ as possible, to the love of God. And so, and so we can just remember this. And actually, Sue, you have your phone. Could you take a picture of this wonderful array of generations? These generations of the church. And be reminded by either the empty chairs on either side, that the church does not belong to any in each generation. And that will keep shifting. Someday, maybe Robbie might be all the way in this chair. That would be amazing. And we will have all been long in this chair. But hopefully there will be still another lineup behind him. And the church does not belong to any of those generations, but belongs to God. And it just is a reminder of the way that we journey through this life of the church, and as part of our membership in the community of saints, which shifts with every generation. Thank you, Sue. And thank you to all our representative saints this morning. You may come on down. Yeah, sure, close the bar. Yeah, absolutely.
Afterwards, I'll be curious to see if all these things agree with the
Yeah, absolutely. I would encourage you, when we have our lunch this afternoon, to chat with each other about the descriptions of your generations and your experience also with the other as, children of different generations and parents of different generations, and see if things line up or if you staunchly disagree with the descriptions of your generation. But for now, let's just take a few moments in silent reflection and consideration of these saints. The saints that were up here, the saints of our church, and the saints on our altar this morning.